A black family vanished in 1982. 20 years later, park rangers found their car deep in the jungle. They were last seen driving into the woods, just a quiet black family out for a weekend picnic. Then they vanished. No crash, no blood, no bodies. For 20 years, nothing but silence, until a hurricane unearthed their car in a place it should have never been. Before I begin, thank you for watching Minority Struggles. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. David Thornton was 12 years old when his family disappeared. At the time, he had been away at summer camp, Camp Cypress Lake, about 2 hours north of home. He left with a bag full of snacks and a comic book tucked into his sleeping bag. He hadn't wanted to go at first, but his father had encouraged it, saying it would be good for him to make friends, to get out of the house, to try new things. The camp counselor who signed him in that Friday morning had no idea he was watching the last moment David would ever spend with his family. His parents, Robert and Lena Thornton, were planning a short weekend getaway with their 6-year-old daughter, Aisha. Nothing complicated, just a scenic drive through Kisatchie National Forest, a few picnic stops, and some rare plant scouting. Robert, a botanist at a regional university, was always talking about the untouched corners of Louisiana, the places tourists didn't go. He'd heard about a patch of land where wild orchids still grew beneath the canopy, and he couldn't resist the urge to see it himself. Lena had hesitated. She didn't mind the outdoors, but she preferred a campground with marked trails and bathrooms. Robert convinced her that it would be quick, in and out by Sunday. No tents, just sandwiches, tea, and a bit of fresh air. Their daughter, Aisha, was thrilled to ride in the back seat without her big brother taking up space. She'd packed her favorite cloth doll, a drawing pad, and a box of crayons. It was supposed to be simple. They drove out that same morning. No one knew exactly what route they took. Robert had an old forestry map, one not included in state park brochures. It showed an overgrown logging road leading into a part of the forest not maintained by rangers anymore. He was curious, maybe too curious. The station wagon was never seen again. Back at camp, David was playing capture the flag when a head counselor pulled him aside. His grandmother had come to pick him up early. She didn't say much on the drive home, just kept her hands tight on the steering wheel, her lips barely moving. At first, David thought something had happened to his grandfather. But when they got to the house, he saw the police car in the driveway. That was when he found out they were missing. The sheriff's office sent out a notice to local parishes that same day. Search teams were organized with volunteers and forestry personnel. Rangers combed the public trails. Helicopters scanned the canopy from above. But Kisatchie was vast, unkind, and unforgiving in the summer months. Without a starting point, it was like throwing darts into a swamp. At the center of the effort was confusion. No one knew where the Thorntons had gone. There was no campsite reservation, no park ranger log, no credit card activity after they left the gas station outside Natchitoches. Deputies questioned neighbors, friends, church members. Nothing strange stood out. The couple had no debts, no enemies, no plans to leave. The assumption from law enforcement, quietly and quickly, shifted to the idea that they must have gotten lost. Or worse, simply driven somewhere they shouldn't have. David didn't understand what any of it meant. One moment, his parents were alive and planning a picnic. The next, their names were printed under the word missing on a photocopied bulletin that would sit folded in his drawer for the next 20 years. The official search lasted 8 days. After that, efforts were scaled back. The forest was too large, they said, too dense. No sign of the vehicle, no bodies, no broken branches, no tire tracks worth following. Rangers suggested that maybe the car went off a ridge and into a ravine. Some said the family might have been swept away by sudden flooding. Others, only in whispers, mentioned human involvement. But nothing was proven, and no one followed up. The fact that the entire family was black didn't go unnoticed by those close to them. Friends, extended family, neighbors, they all felt it. The silence. The urgency that seemed to evaporate after a week. The sheriff's words at the final press conference were hollow. We've done all we can with the resources available. David's grandmother was furious, but she didn't have the power to fight the system. Not in 1982. Not in a rural Louisiana parish where the case stopped making headlines after 10 days. David spent that summer in a house that no longer felt like home. His room still had the board games his sister left scattered across the floor. His parents' toothbrushes remained in the bathroom for weeks. Nobody wanted to touch anything, hoping that maybe they'd just walk through the door again. They never did. By the time school started, people had stopped asking. Teachers didn't mention it. Classmates didn't know what to say. The house was sold the following spring. David and his grandmother moved north, away from the state altogether. But the memories stayed with him. The quiet ride home from camp. The sound of the phone ringing late at night. The smell of his dad's jacket. His mother's scarf, folded on the passenger seat. Every year on June 10th, David marked the day. He didn't tell anyone. He just took the day off work and sat with the old file he kept in a box. Clippings, missing posters, a photocopy of the original forestry map, and a photograph of his parents standing in front of the station wagon with Aisha perched on the hood, arms out like an airplane. He never stopped wondering what really happened. And then, in the fall of 2002, two park rangers walked into a section of Kisatchie that hadn't been touched in decades. That's when everything changed. The official search for the Thornton family began 2 days after they were supposed to return. At first, no one panicked. Delays weren't unusual in rural Louisiana, especially for families venturing into undeveloped forest areas. People assumed the station wagon had stalled, or that Robert Thornton, known for chasing wild plants off marked trails, had simply lost track of time. But by Tuesday, Lena's co-workers at the community health clinic grew concerned. She hadn't called in. She hadn't shown up. A missing persons report was filed that afternoon. Within 24 hours, 2 sheriff's deputies from Natchitoches Parish knocked on the door of David's grandmother's house, where David had been staying since his early pickup from summer camp. He sat on the carpet just outside the kitchen, knees pulled into his chest, listening through the wall as the officers explained the situation. Not much to go on, one of them said. No campsite, no permit records, and those old roads in Kisatchie can lead anywhere. Hell, half of them ain't on maps anymore. The next morning, the first search teams were assembled. David's grandmother insisted on driving to the ranger station to speak directly to whoever was in charge. She brought along a family photo, one taken the month before the trip, showing Robert in his denim shirt, Lena in her Sunday dress, and Aisha beaming from between them with her front teeth missing. They didn't just get lost, she told the officer behind the desk. Something happened. The search began near the Kisatchie Scenic Byway, then fanned out along dozens of old Forest Service roads. Rangers hiked into overgrown trails. Helicopters from the state police made aerial passes. Volunteers from surrounding towns showed up with boots, water jugs, and hope. But Kisatchie was a maze of ridges, sinkholes, low-hanging branches, and dead ends. By the 4th day, the tone shifted. Deputies started using the word lost instead of missing. Some said the Thorntons might have gotten stuck in a gully. Others suggested Robert may have panicked after a wrong turn and kept driving deeper in. One theory even floated the idea that the family had decided to disappear on purpose. That one hit David the hardest. He wasn't allowed to attend the briefings, but he heard enough through half-closed doors. How the lack of tire marks meant the car was probably miles off any known road. How the heavy rainfall that week had washed away potential clues. How there wasn't a single credible witness who'd seen them after Saturday morning. By day 6, the search had slowed. The helicopters stopped. The press stopped calling. Deputies packed up their maps. The official word from the sheriff's office was that all leads had been exhausted. Unofficially, they'd given up. David overheard a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. A ranger telling one of the deputies, "It's Kisatchie. People go in and don't come out, especially if they're not from around here." When the deputy reminded him that the Thorntons were locals, the ranger only shrugged and said, "You know what I mean." Back at the house, David sat in a room he once shared with Aisha, staring at the poster she'd taped to her wall. Cartoon animals, dancing suns, a glittery sticker that said, "Be kind always." He kept the cloth doll she left behind in the back seat of the car and slept with it tucked under his pillow. His grandmother didn't make him give it back. No one had the heart to move her things. His father's desk remained untouched, still covered in field notebooks, loose index cards, and laminated plant samples. A week after the search was called off, David crept in there at night and opened the last notebook his father had used. On the inside cover, Robert had scribbled a note in pen. "There's something untouched in Kisatchie. I want my family to see it before it's gone." That line haunted David, not just for what it implied, but because it was written with such confidence, as if his father believed the forest was something gentle, something to be shared. By July, the case had gone cold. The Thornton family became a footnote, a quiet tragedy, a loss to nature, one that people remembered with a shake of the head, but no real answers. The car was never found. No wallets, no clothes, no bodies. Only silence. In school, David got used to the way people looked at him. Some with pity, some with curiosity, some like he was something fragile. A few kids whispered things about ghosts in the woods or animals dragging people off into the swamp. Adults didn't correct them. Most just tried to avoid the topic entirely. Once, his grandmother took him to the grocery store, and they overheard a woman at the checkout saying, "That's the boy whose family disappeared." As if it was a badge. As if it explained everything about him now. Years passed, and the story faded. The house was sold. The field notebooks were boxed and stored in an attic. The cloth doll remained in David's drawer. Its once bright colors faded. No more news came. No sightings. No new theories. Just whispers about how people shouldn't go too far off the trail. How there were families that crossed invisible lines in that forest and never came back. Some mentioned the Cormier family, though not in public. Everyone in Natchitoches Parish knew about them. Landowners on the edge of the national forest with a reputation for intimidation. Rumors swirled about illegal logging, traps, and worse. But no one ever filed a report. No one ever asked questions. And without any evidence, there was nothing to investigate. David never stopped waiting. Every summer that passed, he marked the date in silence. He watched other families plan vacations, post photographs, come back with stories. And he wondered how far his parents had driven before the trees closed in. How long Aisha had stayed calm. Whether his mother had reached for her scarf. Whether his father had looked behind the wheel and realized they'd made a fatal mistake. The forest had swallowed them whole. And in the decades that followed, it never gave anything back. In the years after the Thornton family vanished, the world around David changed while his own life stayed strangely still. Other kids grew up with graduation photos, prom nights, first cars, and family barbecues. David grew up with a police file, a locked box of old newspaper clippings, and silence that stretched across decades like a second skin. By the time he was 16, he'd stopped talking about what happened. He learned how to answer the question, "What about your family?" with a shrug and a quick change of subject. Friends came and went, most too awkward to ask what they were really wondering. The rare few who did, he cut off. Not because he didn't want to talk, because he didn't have anything new to say. He aged out of sympathy quickly. By his early 20s, the occasional local article on Louisiana's coldest cases would mention the name Thornton, but only in passing. No new information ever came. The case, filed and boxed in a government building miles from where it began, was never officially closed, but no one was working it either. David didn't blame them. Not anymore. He blamed time. He blamed the forest. And sometimes, when he couldn't help it, he blamed himself for not being there. Not because he thought he could have stopped anything, but because being away while it happened made him feel like a survivor of something he never experienced. And that made the guilt worse. He lived with his grandmother through high school. After her passing in 1994, he moved to Baton Rouge and took a quiet job in a university archives department. He liked the silence of it, handling old records, reviewing microfilm, scanning brittle maps and newspapers that had outlived their authors. He understood the weight of history, the way something important could be buried under dust for decades and no one would notice. He kept a locked file drawer under his desk labeled Only Kisatchie. Inside were topographic maps, forestry records, rainfall data from the summer of 1982, and photos of dirt roads printed from satellite images. Some nights, after hours, he'd scroll through obituaries and tax records of known landowners near the forest border, especially anyone with the last name Cormier. Most of them were still around, older, richer, quieter. Some had sold off parts of their land to timber companies. Others had passed their land to family members. No one had ever been arrested for anything that might link them to a missing family. No one had ever even been formally questioned. Every now and then, David would drive out there, not to search that had stopped by his mid-20s, but to stand at the edge of the trees and try to feel something. Recognition, energy, guilt, anything. But the forest always gave him the same answer. Nothing. In 1999, a film crew visited Kisatchie to shoot a nature documentary. One of the producers came across an old ranger bulletin mentioning the Thornton disappearance. They asked David if he'd be willing to talk on camera. He declined. He didn't want their story reduced to local color between shots of armadillos and swamp mist. He wanted the truth or nothing. By 2002, he was 32 years old. He had no children, no siblings, no remaining family beyond a few distant cousins. He lived alone in a modest apartment above a coffee shop near campus. He didn't drink, didn't go out much. His coworkers thought he was quiet but kind. None of them knew what had happened to his family. In May of that year, he got a call from a number he didn't recognize. It was a woman's voice, clear, direct. "Mr. Thornton, this is Detective Kendra Morris, Louisiana State Police. I'm part of the cold case division based in Shreveport. I believe we need to speak in person." David's fingers gripped the edge of the desk. His stomach sank, not with fear, but with something colder. "Hope, I'm listening," he said carefully. "We may have found something in Kisatchie. A vehicle. It matches the make and model of your parents' car. It's old, heavily corroded, but we pulled a plate match." He didn't speak for several seconds. Just let the silence hang between them. "It's been 20 years, he finally said. "Yes, sir. I understand. Al, how was it found?" "There's been storm activity this season. Flooding, mudslides, exposed ravines. 2 rangers were doing an environmental impact assessment in a sector that's rarely accessed. They spotted metal debris from an elevated ridge. When they hiked down, they found the vehicle." She paused. There were no visible remains inside. David didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. "Where exactly?" he asked. She gave him a rough coordinate, well beyond the usual marked trails. A place with no public access roads and no ranger stations nearby. A place, she said, that hadn't been surveyed in decades due to dense terrain and unstable soil. He took down the information, thanked her, agreed to come in for a formal interview. Then he hung up the phone and sat very still in his chair. His first thought wasn't of closure. It wasn't even of grief. It was of the doll. He remembered the cloth doll his sister Aisha had carried everywhere. It had blue button eyes and a stitched red smile. She never let it go, not even in the car. He wondered, without wanting to, if it was still inside that station wagon, buried under roots and rust, waiting for someone to notice. He didn't tell anyone at work why he was taking time off. He packed lightly and drove north in silence. No radio, no distractions, just the long road toward a place that had haunted his memory for 2 decades, toward a wreck in the trees, toward the possibility, finally, of knowing, or at least of naming what was lost. The forest had changed, but only slightly. Roads had been cleared. New signs had been posted. But much of Kisatchie National Forest still looked the same as it had 20 years earlier, dense, tangled, and ancient in a way that made time feel irrelevant. David Thornton stood just outside the restricted perimeter where the vehicle had been found. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground beneath his boots squelched with the soft give of mud and pine needles. Park rangers had marked off the ravine with bright orange tape and thin aluminum stakes. Down below, half buried in earth and shadow, was the twisted back end of the station wagon. Brown, long body, rounded windows. Even through the rust and decay, the shape was unmistakable. It was his family's car. The 2 rangers who had discovered it, Maya Jones and Ben Carter, stood nearby, speaking quietly with one of the forensic techs. Maya had been the first to spot the reflective glint through her binoculars while surveying post-hurricane erosion in a sector of the forest rarely accessed. The previous month's hurricane had ripped through northern Louisiana, toppling trees and flooding lowlands. In some places, whole sections of land had shifted, when a steep ravine gave way under the roots of a cypress. It exposed the roof of the station wagon beneath a collapsed shelf of rock and mud. According to Ranger Carter, the vehicle had likely been hidden there for years, possibly driven down the incline intentionally, then obscured by soil and fallen debris over time. Without the storm's intervention, it might have remained buried for decades longer. Detective Kendra Morris stood at David's side, a clipboard tucked under one arm and a calm, unreadable expression on her face. She had been assigned the cold case unit just 2 years earlier. This was the first real development the Thornton file had ever produced. "I know it's overwhelming," she said gently. "Take your time." David nodded once, eyes locked on the wreck. From this distance, it didn't look real. It looked like something imagined, a ghost image made of rust and vines. But then the light shifted, and the curve of the rear bumper caught a beam of sun. The glint matched exactly the one he remembered catching his eye as a boy when his father pulled into the driveway after work. They allowed him to approach under escort. The forensics team had already begun initial documentation, photographing every visible inch before disturbing anything inside. The station wagon had been partially crushed under years of pressure from fallen trees. Its frame was bent. The windshield had collapsed inward. Thick moss grew inside the car, as if the forest had tried to reclaim it. Through the shattered glass, David saw remnants. On the dashboard, a melted plastic cassette. On the passenger floor, a cracked thermos and the rusted metal edge of a cooler. In the back seat, sunken into rotted fabric, something pale and soft, a fragment of a cloth doll, barely intact. One of the button eyes had come loose. David didn't breathe for several seconds. The weight in his chest refused to move. The back seat was otherwise empty. No bones, no blood, no clothes, no sign that 3 human beings had ever been inside. The vehicle was a sealed chamber of decay, quiet, still, and deeply wrong. Detective Morris motioned to one of the forensic leads, who stepped forward with a box of labeled bags. "We've got a few personal items," she said to David. "We'll need to confirm them with you. You don't have to do it now." David continued staring at the car. "Was it driven here?" he asked finally, his voice quiet. Morris didn't answer right away. The incline sharp, but not impossible. There are older tire impressions under the muck, shallow and faded. Enough to suggest it didn't crash. It was moved here on purpose. Probably pushed the last few feet. David said nothing. She went on. No animals disturbed it. No scavenger signs. That's part of what's so strange. It was sealed in. The earth shifted just enough to cover it completely, but not crush it. You couldn't even smell it. Just moss and mud. Another silence passed between them. Then Morris lowered her voice. "There's something else." She pulled out a small folder from her clipboard and handed it to him. Inside were printed photographs taken during the initial extraction. One showed the car's undercarriage, clear signs of dragging along the rear frame. Another showed the door locks, all in a down position. And then one photo showed the interior from above, taken before any items had been moved. 3 seat belts, front passenger, driver's side, and rear, had all been buckled. No one was inside them. They were strapped in, she said, almost like an apology. At some point, then unbuckled. David turned the folder over and handed it back without a word. He walked a few steps away from the car and looked out toward the surrounding woods. The tree line was thick, but passable. He could see a narrow slope leading deeper into the ravine, and beyond that, the barest edge of a broken path. Not a trail, but something once driven over long ago. It was almost invisible now, just a dent between rows of trees. The Cormier name rose in his mind like steam from a swamp. He didn't say it out loud. Not yet. But he was thinking it. Thinking about the warnings he'd heard over the years, about trespassing in a land that wasn't marked but wasn't safe. Thinking about the silence that followed when the family name came up in local towns. Thinking about his father's curiosity and how it might have taken them one road too far. As the forensic team began preparing to lift the car frame for relocation, David stepped back and let them work. He watched from the ridge, arms crossed over his chest, jaw clenched. It had taken 20 years for the forest to give him this. A rusted car, a half-destroyed doll, a confirmation without answers. But something about the way it was hidden told him the truth was still out there, just beyond the tree line, when no one had looked. By the time the Thornton family station wagon was airlifted from the ravine, the damage was obvious, but not consistent with a crash. The vehicle's roof was partially collapsed, but there were no signs of high-impact trauma. No shattered bones lodged in seats. No dried blood under the dash. It hadn't tumbled. It hadn't caught fire. It had been hidden, placed carefully where it would never be found unless the forest itself moved. The forensics team logged every object inside the car with clinical precision. David sat with Detective Kendra Morris in a temporary trailer parked beside the ranger station. A digital recorder clicked quietly on the table as she read the item list aloud. 1. Children's cloth doll, partial damage. 2. Plastic hairbrush. 3. Thermos, rusted. 4. Map, folded, waterlogged, marked with pen. 5. Audio cassette, melted. 6. Scarf, cotton, floral print. David stopped her. That was my mother's. The scarf. Morris looked up. Are you sure? She wore it every time she rode in the car. She tied it over her hair and knotted it under her chin. I still remember the knot. She nodded and made a note. The map was the only item that sparked interest. It was an older U.S. Forest Service chart, one no longer printed by 2002. A red ink line trailed from the main road to the location where the car was found, but abruptly stopped several hundred yards short. A pen mark circled a clearing labeled only as Unit 7, Survey Restricted. Next to it, a tiny handwritten note, Orchid Runoff, and the initials RT. Robert Thornton had been documenting more than a family outing. He'd likely intended to follow the trail further on foot. The presence of the doll and scarf suggested the rest of the family remained in the car while he went ahead. But the question hung in the air, heavier than anything on the evidence list. Why had they all vanished? Detective Morris wasn't a woman prone to speculation. But even she admitted that the absence of remains, or any sign of struggle, didn't feel accidental. It's almost too clean, she said, tapping the folder. No organic evidence, no teeth, no hair, no fingerprints, even under preserved material. And yet every item inside the car is consistent with 1982. Food wrappers, melted crayons, a half-empty juice box. David stared at the juice box photo. It had once been Aisha's favorite kind. Apple grape. What about outside the car? He asked. Boot prints? Tool marks. We're still scanning, she replied. But the storm damage complicates things. That whole section of land shifted weeks ago. Any physical trace may be long gone. David didn't respond. He already knew what she was going to say next. Without bodies, it would be almost impossible to confirm what happened. The car's placement ruled out an accident. The unbuckled seat belts suggested someone had removed the family after they were already strapped in. But remove them where? And by whom? Behind the scenes, Morris had already begun digging through local records, land plots, old permits, criminal complaints. She didn't name names yet, but David could read between the lines. The area where the car was discovered bordered what used to be an unofficial boundary of the Cormier family's hunting grounds. In the early 80s, several reports had come in about intimidation. Vehicles turned away by men with shotguns, hikers warned not to trespass. But none of it was pursued legally. The Cormiers were known to locals. Feared even. What they did deep in the woods stayed there. David stood outside the evidence trailer later that evening, arms folded tightly across his chest, watching the Rangers pack up for the night. The crime scene tape still fluttered near the ridge. The ravine had been cleared, the car gone, the soil flattened. It looked ordinary now, like nothing had ever happened. Detective Morris joined him. I've worked cold cases for 10 years, she said. I've seen a lot of messy endings. But this feels like someone worked very hard to make sure it would stay unsolved. David didn't look at her. You think they were murdered? She took a moment. Yes, I do. I think whoever did this knew how to cover tracks and had the terrain to make sure no one found out. He nodded slowly. I think it happened fast, she added. No signs of struggle in the car means either your father never made it back, or he came back and was forced to drive them deeper in, or someone else drove the car there entirely. What about the Cormiers? He asked for the first time aloud. Morris exhaled. We're looking into them. Their land borders that area, Yes. In the 1980s, they were known for more than just poaching, illegal timber harvesting, some unlicensed firearms trading. But the records are thin. Local deputies didn't push hard back then. David's voice sharpened. You think my family saw something? It's a theory, she said. A strong one. Your father was a scientist. He carried notebooks, took photos, recorded field notes. If he stumbled onto an operation he wasn't supposed to see, and if someone thought he'd report it. Her voice trailed off. David let the silence stretch. The trees behind them swayed gently in the late afternoon light. Somewhere deep in that forest, 3 people had vanished so completely that even time itself had trouble bringing them back. Will you press charges? He asked. Morris's reply was honest. Not without forensic evidence. And after 20 years, there's nothing to take to the DA. No bodies. No direct link. Not yet. David's jaw tensed. So they get away with it. For now, she said. But this car coming up, it rattled something. People talk. Land changes hands. Someone always knows more than they say. He nodded again, eyes still locked on the trees. That night, back in his motel room, he laid out the photos on the bed. The car, the scarf, the doll, the map. At the center of it all, a family erased. Not by accident, not by nature, but by human choice. Deliberate, hidden, executed with enough time and cruelty to let the forest take the blame. But the forest had finally cracked, and the silence was starting to bleed. The meeting with the Cormiers took place in a sheriff's office conference room, though it wasn't labeled an interrogation. No cameras, no arrest, just a voluntary conversation, as the sheriff called it. 2 brothers from the original clan, Merrill and Clayton Cormier, both in their late 60s, sat across for Detective Kendra Morris. Their attorney arrived minutes before they did. Morris had done her homework. The land the Cormiers controlled in 1982 included the ridge above the ravine where the Thorntons station wagon had been found. That particular section had been leased for unregulated logging at the time, though no official paperwork was ever submitted. In fact, the area had been scrubbed clean from forestry inspection maps during the early 80s, a fact Morris only uncovered through archived paper records left off digital systems. I'd just like to know if you recall seeing this vehicle, Morris said, sliding over a grainy photo of the rusted car. Clayton didn't look. Merrill did, briefly, then shrugged. Don't remember, he said flatly. You own the land within 600 feet of where it was found. Sure did. Still do. Morris leaned forward. You ever hear about the Thornton family? Disappeared in the summer of '82. 3 of them, Robert, Lena, and 6-year-old Aisha. Their son was at camp. That's the only reason he's alive. The room stayed silent. Their attorney cleared his throat. If this line of questioning is going to drift toward accusation, we'll be ending this. No accusations, Morris replied coolly. Just history. Just filling in the gaps. David watched the video footage later. The brothers never lost composure. They didn't react. Not to the doll, not to the scarf, not to the map with Robert's markings. But Morris noticed a shift. When she brought up the land surveys, when she named the exact parcel code that had gone missing from state records, Merrill's gaze twitched toward his brother. It was subtle, but it was there. Still, it wasn't enough. No DNA, no fingerprints. The map wasn't recovered in a way that could hold up in court. And the doll, softened by time and rot, had long lost any trace of who had last touched it. Morris requested a warrant to search the Cormier property. The DA declined. Too old, too speculative, too political. David stood on the edge of the forest again that winter, just before the new year. He had returned to the ravine one last time before heading back to Baton Rouge. The orange tape had been removed. The ground was bare now, smoothed over by weather. If you didn't know what had been there, you wouldn't even stop to look. He sat at the ridge for over an hour, holding a laminated copy of the map they'd found inside the station wagon. Robert Thornton's red ink still ran across the top corner, the handwriting uneven from years of water damage. Orchid runoff. RT. David didn't believe his father had gotten lost. He didn't believe his mother had simply waited in the car for 2 decades to vanish without a trace. And he certainly didn't believe Aisha had wandered into the woods alone, as one early theory once suggested. They were taken, silenced, and buried by people who knew the forest better than the law ever would. In the following years, David kept in touch with Morris. Every now and then, she would forward him a note, a ranger's report, an anonymous tip, a rumor whispered through a third-hand source. But nothing concrete ever emerged. The Cormiers were old now, their sons running the land. But their silence remained generational. David never filed a civil suit. He knew there was no case. He knew the burden of proof was a mountain he'd never climb. Instead, he published. In 2004, a quiet academic journal on environmental justice printed a piece under his name, The Forgotten: Environmental Displacement and the Disappearance of the Thornton Family. It didn't name the Cormiers, but it documented the gaps in land use, the hidden leasing arrangements, the lost maps, and the systematic underinvestigation of rural black families who vanished under questionable circumstances. It caught some attention. Not much, but enough that it was cited again in 2007, then included in a broader study on racial disparity in missing persons cases. He never gave up on the idea of a full reckoning, but he stopped waiting for it. On the 20th anniversary of the discovery, the fall of 2022, David returned to Kisatchie. This time, he brought a small wooden box. Inside were the doll fragment, the scarf, and a sealed copy of his published paper. He placed them in a shallow hole near the ridge and covered it with earth. No gravestone, no marker, just memory. Before he left, he whispered something to the soil. He said it softly, just in case Aisha could still hear him somehow. The jungle had taken them, but not all the way. Not anymore. Their car had been found. Their story had been told. And somewhere, even in silence, that had to mean something.